Testing. Good morning, everyone, and those who are on our remote channel. My name is Fran Hackney, and I'm here this morning to introduce our speaker, Dr. Deirdre Johnston. Dr. Deirdre Johnston retired from Hope's College Communications Department after 27 years of teaching and challenging students. She went to Drake University for her BA, got her MA from the University of Texas, and her PhD in communications from the University of Iowa. So even her degree is well-traveled. She led studies abroad in various countries: Japan, Northern Ireland, Scotland, South America, and our topic today, South Africa. She created a lot of communication courses for students related to peace and conflict, and connected students in the US with students in Lebanon, Pakistan, Slovakia, and Saudi Arabia. While she's retired now, she is still working as a dialogue and diversity consultant and as a global learning workshop facilitator. So let's welcome Dr. Johnston this morning. And please silence your cell phones.
See if we're on. We're on. All right. It's wonderful to be with you here this morning on this rainy, cold April day. There's no better place to be, right? In a nice, warm, lit classroom. Today, I want to talk a little bit about South Africa. And as we get started, I couldn't figure out any way to do this without spending some time talking about the context of South Africa, just because you may be coming from different knowledge bases and you may, like me, need a review of this every once in a while. So it's only by understanding the context of South Africa that we can truly understand about race in South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa today. So I'm going to do a brief, hopefully, I'm going to keep timing myself, checking my watch, historical overview to provide you some context for this. I'm going to talk about a global education research project that brought students together from 3 countries to do research in South Africa. Then I'm going to share a little bit about that research with you and 3 key findings that we have identified thus far. Then talk a little bit about parallels with racism in the United States. Are there things that we can learn from South Africa and their experience that would help us today in our society as we address racism in the United States, recognizing that these are 2 very different contexts with very different histories as well. So we can't conflate them and say it's the same in both places. It is not. The experience of people is different. And then I want to leave you with a couple of ideas, and hopefully not too theoretical, on transcending some dialectics, these tensions around racism. And maybe these are things that apply to South Africa and also could apply to us as we work to heal racism in the United States. So that's what we're going to do this morning. So South Africa, 60 years of apartheid. Just your brief overview, reminder of the history, recent history of South Africa. I'm not starting in the 1600s when the Dutch first arrived, but the 1940s was the orchestration, the setup of a system of apartheid. Apartheid meaning separation of people on the basis of race. Where did South Africa leaders get their ideas for this? United States. Nazi Germany. Okay, so look at your time period, look at what was going on in those countries, and absolutely people were involved from the United States and from Nazi Germany in terms of setting up the system. In the 1950s, Black South Africans organized the African National Conference, and this was called the Defiance Campaign. And this was in the early days of Nelson Mandela. He was educated as a lawyer, and he was working with people for civil disobedience, peaceful resistance to the system that had been set up to oppress Blacks and others in South Africa. In the 1960s, the government of South Africa, the state police, responded with violence to peaceful protests. There are a couple of critical ones, the Sharpsville massacre, where 64 people, I believe, were killed. And you've got a peaceful protest. The state police come in with guns and just start mowing people down. There's also a very famous school protest where school children, elementary students, religious leaders, middle school students, high school students came out of their schools to protest in the streets and were marching down the street. And they were protesting because they were forced to learn in Afrikaans. And that is a language that's kind of a blend of Dutch and German that is unique to South Africa and to the white Afrikaner community in South Africa. And that was not their language. And so they were protesting and children were shot and several were killed. So now things are changing in the 1960s. When you're going to have a peaceful protest and you're going to be mowed down with guns on the other side, that sort of forced the hand of the African American Congress, not African American, African National Conference, to become militarized. And so you see other communist countries in the world supplying arms to this group. The arms coming in through Mozambique, Angola, into South Africa, a lot of arms smuggling, and then we've got a military confrontation on our hands. And so that really characterized a lot of the 1970s with the militancy of this, what started as a peaceful movement. 1990s, we have the ending of apartheid, so a decade of transition of recently Nelson Mandela out of jail, where he had been for 20 years, working with de Klerk, the current Afrikaan president of South Africa, to work together to negotiate a peace and to move forward as a unified country. And it's truly miraculous when you look at that peace process and what happened in South Africa, an absolute miracle, with some just incredible leaders that were able to make that happen. And that I attribute to Archbishop Desmond Tutu and President Nelson Mandela. I think without their leadership, their vision, their intellect, this would all have fallen apart in very significant ways. So just remarkable, remarkable people. So I want to address reasonably quickly 7 challenges that endure for South Africa. So we reached the end of the 1990s. Apartheid has fallen. We are the rainbow nation. We're moving forward. We're now 25 years later. Things are not going so well. So what are some of the challenges that endure for South Africa today, 25 years later into post-apartheid? One is how to unite a very disparate nation. And I'll touch on each of these individually, but just give you the preview. Another is immigration into South Africa. Another is labor and ownership. How do you have fair labor practices? How do you transfer ownership from the minority Afrikaner ownership of the mines to increase Black ownership within the country? Government corruption is rife. HIV/AIDS has been just tremendously debilitating for the country and taken a lot of resources. Race integration is still a significant problem, and poverty, health, and education challenges. Okay, so, and again, I'm just going to touch on a few of these things, but just to give you a feel for this, as some of the challenges of, you can't just say, oh, okay, apartheid's gone, now everything's great. It's not, it's going to take time, and it's a challenge. So one of the things is South Africa is fascinating. You want to think of South Africa as black and white. It's not black and white. There are so many different cultural groups with their own culture and their own language in South Africa. So when you have 11 official languages in the country, 7 additional unofficial languages, and a multitude of dialects of those languages, and each of those have their own cultural heritage and legacy. Wow, how do you bring people together? Yeah. How do you unite a country across race in a country apartheid has fractured? So apartheid was all about separating people. Okay? What's unique about South Africa, especially compared to the United States, is the majority of people in South Africa are Black. They were the oppressed group, but they were the majority. But recognizing that when we talk about Black South Africans, we're talking about all those different cultural groups, all those different languages, and conflating it into one, which really isn't fair to those groups. You have 9% of the population in South Africa today is colored. Okay, what does that mean? That's a term in the United States that we don't use anymore, right? Ooh. In South Africa, that term is used to refer to mixed race persons. By mixed race, that may be Malay, Muslim. I'll talk a little bit about where people have come from, that they've landed in South African, Indian, Blacks, across all of those different ethnic Black groups and traditions, and whites, primarily Dutch. Whites arrived in the 1600s and the Brits arrived in the 1800s. They're not that, the British population, white population in South Africa is not very large today. They had kind of had to go back to Europe around the time of World War I and World War II and faced problems on their home front. And so they essentially left South Africa for that part. Malay people came from the Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. Today, Malay is used as a kind of all-encompassing term to refer to anyone who identifies as Muslim. In South Africa, you were called Malay, whether you really came from Southeast Asia or not, but that's the tradition of the Malay. They were brought in as slaves. They were brought in as indentured servants. The Indian population arrived in the 1800s and were brought in by the Brits, right? Forced labor, indentured servants again, to provide labor for the mining industry, the diamond mines, the gold mines, the platinum mines that the Brits owned at that time, okay? Then you've got 9%, and it's now a little more like 8.5% white, mostly Afrikaan. So the word Afrikaan refers to the Dutch white population in South Africa. Originally arrived in the 1600s, settled, fought the British over throughout the 1800s to get control, and they ended up assuming control of South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. So when we refer to Afrikaans, they have their own language, which is called Afrikaan, and that is a blend of adulteration of German and Dutch together, and small number of British. 3% Indian today, and then less than probably 1 or 2% San. San were the indigenous people of South Africa. They were the people that were there before anybody else was. And so when the settlers first arrived in the 1600s, they encountered the San communities, which were relatively peaceful, and they pretty much got wiped out in the legacy of the history of South Africa. So how do we unite people, still not uniting, how do we unite people separated by economic disparity? We've got World Bank in 2018, and this is consistent figures for 21, 22 now. So South Africa has the greatest income inequality in the world. Number one, greatest income inequality. And you can see this here with Soweto, you probably heard of as a township. People are living, there are some houses with indoor plumbing in Soweto, but there are also large swaths of millions of people that are living in these types of townships with corrugated metal, cardboard, scraps of wood for their house, dirt floors, a pump where you might be able to get water, fresh water from a well. Way at the back side, you might have to walk several blocks, are some outhouses for sanitation facilities. And then you have beautiful, beautiful, luxurious areas in South Africa. How do you unite people separated by a legacy of murder, torture, and oppression? How do you get over this? How do you move on past this? And we also have some of these same challenges in the United States. Sorry, skipped over that very quickly, but we'll come back to violence. There'll be plenty of it, don't worry. Second challenge, immigration. So there are 2.5 to 5 million illegal immigrants in South Africa, in a country of about 59 million people. These immigrants are coming from Malawi, Sudan, Mozambique, into South Africa from the north. There are jobs in South Africa, so you go when you are destitute to where you can find some sort of employment. The borders on the north of South Africa are porous. It's very difficult for them to regulate that. And what has resulted is very frightening xenophobia in South Africa, where the South Africans, blacks and whites alike, turn against these immigrants who are coming in from other parts of Africa. Why? Because they're limited jobs, limited resources, and here's another group of people coming in that can take some of those jobs and take some of those resources. This has led to violence. A lot of the immigrants who come in will work in the mines in horrible conditions, and they live in camps. And there have been violence in the camps, which also often abut on the edges of these townships. So they're nearby, and then you see violence erupt between the groups. Poor living and working conditions, competition for resources. And I put a white rhino there. That's a picture that I took in South Africa in 2018. At that time, they estimated 6 to 12 white rhinos left in the country of South Africa. Why is that? Poaching. Poaching is not solely on the part of immigrants coming in, but it largely is. So they come in from the north, and if you can kill a rhino and get that horn, you can sell it for $300,000, $20,000 a kilo. So think about how that would change your life if you had nothing. Would you risk that? So it's a terrible problem. It's difficult to regulate. You've got large spaces of land, and you've got to have rangers who try to protect the rhinos. When I was staying in South Africa in 2015, in the northern part of South Africa, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm sleeping in Kruger National Park, and I hear rifle shots and a helicopter going overhead. And they had identified 2 poachers. They shot them from the helicopter. They killed 2 young men. The rhino's already dead. And it was just devastating. So complicated problems facing South Africa. Labor and ownership, our third problem. You've got 37 to 39% unemployment in South Africa today. Particularly youth unemployment is very, very high. You've got a problem with ownership. So here you've had a system where the Afrikaans were the owners of the mines and the businesses and the industry. And now you're trying to change the society to give the majority more ownership in the structure and industry of South Africa. So when apartheid fell, there were elaborate plans that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the transfer of farmland to Black ownership, the transfer of some of these mines and industries to Black ownership. That process has gone very, very slowly. The farmland issue is you'll see farms in South Africa where there will be an Afrikaan-owned farm, and the cattle are looking really good and they're out grazing in the field. Right next to it is a farm owned by a Black South African, and the cattle are emaciated where you can see every bone and rib in the cattle. Why? Because the Afrikaans have very successfully diverted the water supply to their farm, leaving the next door neighbors absolutely destitute, unable to grow crops, unable to keep their cattle alive. So these are the kinds of problems that don't change overnight. The mines in South Africa in the 1800s, the Brits came in and bought up a lot of land for mining. They exploited labor. People were working under horrendous conditions. They still work under horrendous conditions today in these mines. So gold, platinum, diamonds, think about where your products are coming from. This was the Marikana mine massacre 2012, which is still a raw incident in South Africa. Miners were armed with sticks and they went on strike, and they were on top of this big hill, and there were probably couple of thousand of miners. The police show up in their riot gear and their guns, and they start shooting with live ammunition. And a number of people were killed in that mine massacre. So you see mine protests going on repeatedly. So this was 2012, but you see this happening today also. Government corruption. How are you feeling? We got problems. So this is a Ramaphosa at the top is the current president of South Africa, who has been under investigation. Just in the last 2 weeks, they have exonerated him, but the investigation is still going on. Something about hiding thousands of dollars in his mattresses on his farm. I don't know. Why? Why do you hide it in the mattress? President Zuma, the preceding president, we thought Ramaphosa was, wow, there's going to be transparency, there's going to be ethics. This is the hope for South Africa to get beyond this corrupt government leadership. Zuma was president in the 2015, 16, 17, 18, that period. He was indicted for all sorts of crimes, money laundering, taking money. And again, you've got a country that needs these resources, needs government funds, and they're being siphoned to elites and stolen right out from underneath the people that need them. He was sentenced to 15 months in prison for just, the list of crimes is long. He got out after 2 months. So there are still court cases going on trying to come back and get him. The Guptas were a group of 3 brothers from India who came in and milked South Africa for billions of dollars. Money laundering, they bought industry, they bought utility companies, and then they didn't deliver the utility and they just skimmed off money all over the place. Again, the rap sheet on them is quite long. In the news within the last 3 or 4 days, South Africa was trying to extradite them because they ran off to Dubai. So when Zuma went down, who was their co-conspirator, they ran off to Dubai and they thought that they had the extradition treaty all set as of January of this year. And just within the last 3 or 4 days, Dubai has reneged on that and is not releasing the Guptas to stand trial in South Africa. But again, you've got resources in a country, but you've got corruption. So the money isn't going to the infrastructure and the people that need it. But this is not to say, I mean, and it's easy to say, oh my goodness, now that we've got anti-apartheid, the Afrikaners are out of power and we've got Black leadership, see how corrupt things are? They were corrupt before. They were corrupt under the apartheid system. It was just the Afrikaners that were benefiting from that corruption. And you've got, again, a system, a network, a culture of bribery and extortion and embezzlement that has been around for a long time. So I wouldn't say that it's just in recent history that that corruption has come. So again, money is going to the elites, not to the people. HIV/AIDS, absolutely astounding. 1 in 5 people. Think about the financial toll that takes, the number of orphans, children orphaned by HIV/AIDS in the country, long-term costs of care for the disease. Why is that so high in South Africa? Large part because of the mining community. So when you take people, typically men, away from their homes and their villages, and you put them in a mining camp for 12 months of the year, and then they get maybe a week or so to go home, the ability to contract AIDS under those conditions and then come home and spread it to your wife and then your children who are born is a real problem. Race integration. This one I think is really interesting. This is a recent survey from the Justice and Reconciliation Commission in Johannesburg of the percentage of people in South Africa who rarely or never interact with others outside their racial group. And we're looking at, let's say, an average of 50% here across different contexts of work and study, home, shops, social gatherings, communal gatherings, religious gatherings. And you see this both for Blacks, for whites, and for colored people is quite high. So people are staying within their own groups. That's not conducive to the healing that is required in terms of racial issues. Poverty, health, and education. We could spend a lot of time talking about this. I'm simply going to make some, you get the sense now. you have an understanding now that there are going to be significant problems. So you've got wealth inequality. You've got 9 million people living in these informal settlements, 9 million people. And then you have beautiful, beautiful, luxurious areas with a great deal of money and luxury. So the contrast is stark. That leads to health problems, health access, education within the informal settlements is hit and miss. Very difficult for people to get ahead. South Africa's strengths. All right. Natural resources. Oh my gosh, look at the natural resources in this country. And again, the gold, the platinum, mining wealth that is available there, vineyards, South African wines, produce, the farms and things that are grown in South Africa. You've got the natural habitat, South Africa, absolutely phenomenal. You have infrastructure. The infrastructure doesn't always work successfully. When you talk to people, they will complain about the electrical grid going down with some regularity. But you do have transportation infrastructure, public transportation within the city areas, and a rising Black middle class that will hopefully, over time, kind of settle these themselves. You also have some progress with race reconciliation. This again was a recent survey that 50 to 60% of South Africans agree that progress has been made toward racial reconciliation. That's not 90%. That's not saying how much progress, but progress has been made. So, I mean, that is encouraging, hopeful. Okay, so that's your historical, cultural, very quick, superficial background on South Africa. Talk a little bit about this research project and what we did in South Africa. So we had students from Hope College, from Bratislava International School of Liberal Arts in Slovakia, and from Foreman Christian College in Pakistan. So one of the things that I was doing when I was at Hope was trying to encourage people, both at Hope and at our partner institutions through the GLCA and internationally, to conjoin courses, connect their courses. So if I teach intercultural communication on Hope College's campus in Holland, Michigan, what if I connect with a professor teaching intercultural communication in Saudi Arabia, which I did? And what if we bring our classes together via technology and students can collaborate, work on projects together, have discussions together, present to each other? It is an incredible experience and a rich educational experience. So for this particular project, we brought 3 schools together, Slovakia, Pakistan, and Hope College. Students began this with a semester joined course, so each on our own campuses. So I taught a Peace and Conflict in South Africa course at Hope College that was joined with these other 2 institutions. We followed pretty much the same syllabus through the semester, did the same readings, that sort of thing. The purpose of the course was to educate students about South Africa, peace and conflict in South Africa, but it was also for them, we thought it was very important that they first understand their own domestic context of oppression within their own society and that they teach each other. And it was so cool. So we focused on race in the United States. So the Hope College students learned more about race and history of race in the racism in the United States. And then they taught that to the Slovakian students and the Lebanese students. In Slovakia, the students focused and learned about the oppression of the Roma community in Eastern Europe. And then they taught that to the Hope students and to the Lebanese students. The Lebanese students focused on sectarianism, religious Christian Muslim sectarianism, the civil war in Lebanon that has shaped that country's history. They taught that to the Hope students and the Slovakian students. At the same time that we're learning about South Africa, because the very important point is that we should learn about our own context before we go over and say, oh my, don't they have problems over there? Well, we also all have problems, and we see a lot of parallels in the history of those situations. Then it's really cool. So often we teach these courses and the students never meet each other in person. This time we wrote a grant. We got some money so that all the students could travel together to South Africa, a neutral context, It wasn't any one where any group had a particular privilege or history or more expertise than the other. So in a more neutral context to study the race in South Africa. I did this twice. This particular time that I'm going to talk about, the more recent time, we did a research project. And so the students were put in 3-person research teams, 1 person from each country. So you have 3 different cultural perspectives coming into that interview. We did 80 interviews that lasted an hour, hour and a half sometimes with people in South Africa. And video recorded those interviews. The students, it was very important to us that they got as much cultural immersion as possible in their experience. So we did homestays in South Africa where they were staying with families, and we made those contacts largely through church communities, in Black communities, colored communities, and white African communities. And what's interesting is these students coming from the outside got exposure to settlements, colored settlements and Black settlements across South Africa that many people living in South Africa have never seen or visited. So you will encounter many people from an African heritage perspective who have never seen or been in one of these townships or settlements. So who did we interview? The group of interviewees was racially diverse and also diverse over age and generation. So what we wanted was to find people who came of age during the Sharpeville massacre when the state invoked violence against protesters, during the Soweto uprising when things started to become more militant on both sides with the use of weapons. The Rainbow Nation generation who came of age with this hope of Mandela and Tutu saying, we are united, we are a Rainbow Nation, apartheid, it's done, it's over, we have a new constitution. If you want fun reading, read the South African Constitution. It is an amazing and beautiful document, just absolutely incredible. So the hope and excitement of the Rainbow Nation, and then the Born Frees are the people that were born since 2000 or 1996 or so, in the late 1990s and the 2000s, who did not grow up or come of age under the apartheid system. So there's some research that suggests that what's happening politically at the time that you're coming of age, when you're 18, 20, 22, when you're really starting to first tune in to kind of political and social issues, shapes your perspective going forward in your life. And so that's one of the questions that we asked. With a fascinating sample of people, by coincidence, we have among these interviews, Walter Sisulu, if you know, is an activist for the anti-apartheid struggle, very, very famous, who was imprisoned on Robbins Island at the same time that Mandela was imprisoned. His niece and granddaughter, who have Hope College connections, ironically. Hendrik Verwoerd's grandson. So this is the president in South Africa in the 1940s and 50s who orchestrated the apartheid system. His grandson has now broken from the family. It's really a sad story in the way that his family doesn't really want to have anything to do with him any longer because he's working for reconciliation. And he's working through Stellenbosch in the theology department and with the township and working toward reconciliation. Very interesting person. Winnie Mandela's brother. Wow. I mean, that was so cool. You went inside on the Mandela and their marital relationships. Talk to Winnie Mandela's brother. So just incredible information. Michael Laxley is also a very famous person. He's an Anglican priest from New Zealand who came to South Africa in the 1970s. And he became militarized, is that the word I want? Probably not. It recognized for him that the only way forward was violence. The Anglican Church really didn't like that, so they excommunicated him for a time, and he worked with the anti-apartheid struggle over 20 years. He was actually, there were death threats against him, and so he was exiled. Not even going to say which country, maybe Mozambique, maybe Angola. In the 1990s, again, apartheid starting to fall apart and peace is on the horizon. He's in exile over the border. He receives a package, there's a bomb inside, it blows off both of his arms and part of his face. He survived. that and now started an institute called the Healing of Memories, where he helps people process the trauma of apartheid and the anti-apartheid struggle and come to terms with that, to how to take that and move on with their lives. So very interesting man. Desmond Tutu's personal assistant during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What an interesting person to talk to for the inside scoop of all the players in that process. So these are some of the people that we interviewed. Also, just to recognize that people that were in these interviews, there were African National Congress fighters, militants, former militants. There are clergy on all sides of the racial divide. There are political activists. There are, so just a broad range of people. So the research steps. This was from the Grand Rapids Museum, had this exhibit. That's the picture of this research project. So part of the reason I retired was that I could dive into this and get a book out on this process. That's me. So the reason you don't do 80 oral history interviews is this. Typically on an oral history project, you might have 12 interviews or 20 interviews that you transcribe and you analyze. You don't do 80. So we had to transcribe 120 hours of video recordings. And I can't tell you how long and grueling and tedious that is. Voice recognition software does not understand a South African person speaking in English. That's not the first language of most South Africans, right? There's no voice recognition that works. So it has to be done by hand. It's word by grueling word. Then you take all of those transcribed interviews, and I use a program called Navivo, and you upload it into a program where you can code it. So you go through every word of the transcript and look for, oh, does that have something to do with violence? Does that have something to do with peace? Does that have something to do with family? Does that have something to do with the economy? Does that have something to do with political participation? You code it for keywords. You highlight the part where that is talked about. Again, takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to do this, down to very words, phrases, sentences, and you code it by a theme and a label. But that allows you to run analyses. So now I can type into the program reconciliation, and up pops everybody who has talked about anything related to reconciliation. I can see that all together, and I can look for themes, I can look for patterns. And then I can look at the cross analyses of two variables. So were you physically wounded during the anti-apartheid struggle? Then how do you talk about reconciliation? So I can pull out just those people. So I can pull it out by race, I can pull it out by age, I can pull it out by political participation, I can cross any of these variables. So it's a very, very powerful tool for doing qualitative analysis if you get all the stuff done at the beginning, which takes years. So then a process of identifying, categorizing the findings, then you've got to have cross-coder validity checks. So if I am transcribing, I've got to have somebody else go through that same interview and look at my transcription and see if it's accurate. That takes then double time. If I'm coding, I've got to see if somebody else is also seeing reconciliation or forgiveness or religious faith or political participation at the same point that I am in these transcripts, and see that we correspond on the codings and that we're hitting the same thing. So the other thing that you got to do that I think is part of how I feel intimidated about this project, and sometimes just paralyzes me with moving forward with it, is I am white. I am racially privileged. I am an American. Who am I to say anything to anybody about what's going on in South Africa, right? So owning that, there are a couple of advantages. One is that you can see a more holistic view. You can see patterns of things from an outsider's perspective that sometimes is fresh eyes on a situation. Okay? But that bird's eye view doesn't really get down into the details, does it? Okay? So you have the advantage, bird's eye view, but not the details. The other thing that we found when doing the interviews was that many people felt that they couldn't talk about their trauma and things that had happened to them in South Africa with other South Africans. But you guys are outsiders, you're here for a day and then you're gonna leave. I'll talk to you. And so in particular, we worked, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, a church called the Uniting Reformed Church in Mossel Bay in a Black township. And people there carried a lot of trauma with them. I'll give you just one example. It was a woman whose 10-year-old son was running down the road and was shot in the back 35 years ago. She is caring for him now, still. Never really had a chance to talk about that because she said, who am I to talk about my sorrow when everybody else is experiencing sorrow too? But she told her story and she wept. And I will never forget her in my arms. I'm holding up this woman who's larger than I am, weeping on my shoulder, saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for coming. And thank you for starting this conversation within our community. So it took an outsider to feel safe with an outsider disclosing some of that information, letting go of it and talking about it. The downside, you can't see the details. You don't know the details. You don't know enough to make sense of those details. You can only imagine the experience. It's not my experience. I can only imagine, and that is a partial understanding at best. I've not experienced the impact of this trauma. And so when you're talking to somebody who is traumatized, that's a very different thing. I have a limited understanding of people's motivations for their behavior and actions. I'm from the outside. I'm often from a different race identity and a different level of privilege. The other thing is with oral history interviews, I think that you always have to own is that I can leave and go home. And when people share their stories and they share them with us and sign a release to have these stories shared to broader audiences, they can't leave that situation. They go back and face their community and the consequences of speaking out and talking. So those are some of the difficulties we have with research. So analysis of themes. What is a dialectic? Ooh, I wanted to be a little further along, so I'm going to speak a little faster here. Dialectic is an oppositional tension. You think of a continua that is both things are true and you kind of slide back and forth on this tension. So when my children were in university and college and they would come home for visits, oh my gosh, euphoria, right? My children are home. There is nothing better. My joy, I was exuberant. And when they left, my joy was exuberant. Okay, that's a dialectic. It's both and, okay? So what I found in some of this data were three dialectics that I want to talk to you about today. One is violence versus just move on. Both of these are narratives that define the racial tensions in South Africa, and people kind of slide along this dialectic and they're caught in between this without a clear way out. So cultural narrative of violence, what do we mean by that? When violence is normalized, that's a cultural narrative of violence, and we should be watching for this in the United States. At the time when you say, oh, another shooting, that's the normalization of violence. It's a very dangerous thing. Mob violence. There's an expression in South Africa called the smoke that calls. So tremendous problems with mob violence. This is an example of a Zama, which is a immigrant camp, labor camp that was burned. The suspects were stripped and beaten after the gang rape of 8 women and little police response. This was July of 2022. So what you find and what fuels this narrative, cultural narrative of violence, is when there isn't appropriate response within the system and structure. You can't trust the law enforcement to be there for you. So they're just heart-rending quotes from people. These 8 women were models, and they were with a video crew, and they had gone to a mine area to do a music video, broad daylight. They were accosted at gunpoint by a group of men, gang raped. The community cried to the police, we are not safe here. You've got to do something. You need to come in. The police went over with a helicopter, never really came to the ground to do anything about it. So the community took their justice into their own hands and burned the camp where I would presume many innocent immigrants were also living and working, and again beat these men. So that's a culture of violence when other ways of resolving conflict, mediation, communication aren't working, and the infrastructure isn't there that you can trust that people are going to respond appropriately to support you. That's when you get a culture of violence. Unresolved trauma. So this is hard to understand, isn't it? We talk a lot about trauma in our society, and it's hard to understand. And I think it's somewhat helpful to look at, scroll down on this, some of the characteristics of unresolved trauma: post-traumatic stress disorder, stress hormones, relationship problems, sense of guilt, shame, difficulties regulating emotions, distorted self-image, low self-esteem, sense of hopelessness, anxiety, fear, sleep disorders. That's a lot. And that plays out in how you respond when you're put under pressure, you're confronted, you're challenged, when you feel like nobody's got your back, nobody's supporting you, things aren't changing. And so that plays into that. Then you've got people, and this was particularly true in the Mossel Bay community that you'll hear more about, who were fighters, militants for the African National Congress. If you spend your youth, your 20s into your 30s as a militant, and then somebody says, it's all over, we're done, go back home, what do? You don't have an education, you don't have a skill set, you don't have a job. And so here's this community in Mossel Bay with former militants who've never figured out how to reintegrate into society. Okay. Then you've got anger from the Afrikaan community, essentialized in this quote that you hear in all sorts of ways throughout these transcripts. You've taken what is mine, now you've broken it. And first, I built it. It was mine. I built it. I built the country. I'm the white Afrikaner. I built the infrastructure. You broke it. Now things are a mess. So you hear that anger. So you hear this narrative of violence on both sides, and then you have violence on both sides. So Afrikaners, there's a recent example in January of this year of a group who beat very badly a young Black boy, I think he was 10, 11 years old, at a swimming pool because he didn't belong there. So violence is on both sides. We got to all own it. Okay? And then on the other side of this tension is we just need to carry on. We just need to move on. So it's a thing of the past. Let's not talk about it. I'm tired of hearing about it. You're just making me feel guilty or making me feel like I have shame. Don't make me change. Let me keep my traditions. And this particularly comes with the Afrikaan language and efforts to keep that language. And again, that's 9% of the population, but was the dominant language that everyone was sort of imposed upon them in the educational system and in employment. Okay. This was a sample of, this is one of the settlements, townships, and this is a lavish golf course right up in the butts. Just a great visual of this disparity. Another example of this, just carry on, Victoria and Albert waterfront development was really developed 2011. So this is after the fall of apartheid, right? Why, if you were working toward racial reconciliation and inclusion in your society, would you name it the Victoria and Albert waterfront development, right? That's not inclusive. It is a place, and this is a quote from their advertising, high-end restaurants, hotels, shops with a high security presence. That's not talking about inclusion. That's, we want things the same as they were in the past and we don't want to change. Okay? Second dialectic, this tension is one between justice and forgiveness. So on the justice side, we hear people crying for accountability at the highest levels. At the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were people that were supposed to be prosecuted in the criminal system. That largely did not happen. And if it did happen and anybody ended up in jail, which there were very few of them, then they were pardoned. subsequently. So that call for justice, why aren't the people who committed murder and torture, why aren't they being held responsible? That we need punitive sentences, that there isn't fairness and equity in the law and the criminal justice system, that reparations have not come. So this transfer of ownership and reparations for loss after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a whole plan for this, largely hasn't happened. Land reform, again, that taking the resources and water resources and making sure that it gets to all farms. Basic humanity, access to education, healthcare, and jobs. Here we are 25 years later, people are saying, and this hasn't changed. On the other side, you have this saying, we are a culture of forgiveness. And there are tremendous examples of this. So Desmond Tutu talks about there is no future without forgiveness. And this is all that he was about with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are a couple of great examples of that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is one example that you could testify before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and they could grant you amnesty for your crimes because they said the truth is more important than justice. Punitive sentence. We want the truth. We want the story. People want to know what happened to their loved ones, where they're buried, where the bodies are. Another example of forgiveness is the Free State University had a case where 4 white African students started harassing a group of Black men who were working as janitors. They forced the men to drink urine. This was caught on videotape. This is long after apartheid. This is in the 2000s. It was caught on videotape. It goes viral. I mean, it was horrendous. The president of the Free State University was a Black man. And he said, we need to forgive. We are going to forgive. So you see, again, a cultural narrative, strong cultural narrative of forgiveness. Oh, I got to get going here. The last dialectic is one of acknowledgement of injustice and pain. So hear people's stories of pain and trauma, say, yes, this happened to you. I believe you. Because if I say, oh, you know, I'm exaggerating a little bit, that really didn't happen, that wasn't so bad, then I'm denying who they are. So that acknowledgement versus ignorance and bliss. So I'm going to show you a conversation. This wasn't one part of the interviews, but this is where we brought a community together in Mossel Bay, South Africa, in a Black township. This is the Uniting Reformed Church, which we can talk more about in question time. And we had with our group of students present, and then we had members of the community of the township. A lot of these former militants of the African National Congress were part of that. Some Black ministers from the area. Yeah. So kind of and then one African man. So that's where this group is not balanced for a dialogue. And that's where things kind of get dicey. Preceding this clip, I'm going to show you, people had shared, Black community members, experiences they've had during apartheid, post-apartheid, struggles, trauma, violence, and share these stories that were just heart-rending and took your breath away. Then the African minister speaks.
Invitation from our side. I'm a white male, and white male in South Africa is always put into the guilt chair because we were part of the system. And so in a conversation like this, you know, my reaction would be to hear the stories, and my first reaction would be to hear it in a way of, you know, the sadness of it. You know, and a first reaction can always be to say, well, I'm sorry. I was also part of that system. But I've never seen that bad side of that system. Never.
Nonverbals.
I grew up in the apartheid system. I grew up on a farm. My father and his workers had a very good relationship. I was And the person who was my father's first hand came 50 kilometers just to meet me and hug me and tell me the good stories of my father, of the way he treated him with dignity, with integrity, and you know, but I sit here and when I hear the stories, you know, and everywhere we go, we always hear we are the guilty part, and you know, and I've never seen or you know, done something like that to anyone. I grew up as a Christian person, and I hear about you know, discrimination, and I can see that people were treated very badly, and I can see the inhuman way in which people were treated. But now, you know, South Africa has changed a lot, and white people now come into a situation where you ask, do you have a place here? Many people are working outside. Children of our people like me, you know, children go into other places to try and find, because we also don't see hope and future. It's really difficult if you experience a situation where there's a sort of a experience of reverse discrimination, where you have the same credentials but you can't go to a university or this or that now. So you experience some of that, and you experience hatred. You've done nothing wrong to other people, but you were part of that system, and now you experience hatred from people. You know, and I said to someone, 162 farmers was killed this year, 2018 in South Africa. How many? 162. So now, you know, that situation must also be heard. And what about that sort of inhuman, absolutely inhuman way of treating people? We also have some stories about, you know, inhuman treatment from our side. So from our side, I would say, you know, it's also necessary to come together and hear all the different stories, because I can see, you know, a system has brought some very bad things about, and it will take a very long time to heal, a very long time. But we in the future together, and we must hear the different stories and try to create more spaces where we can come together and talk about
it. Steer here with me so that I don't know. Go away.
I hear about, you know,
Okay. Where's Ian? All right. Just got to get out of this so I can get back to the slides. And I can't do it on the screen. I'm supposed to do it on this mouse. That should, oh, escape, maybe that will. Nope, doesn't like that either. That probably just escaped from my whole presentation. Okay, I think we're good. Are we? Okay, so we're talking about this acknowledgement versus injustice or pain, or acknowledgement of injustice and pain versus blissful ignorance here. And just the definition of acknowledgement as truth or existence of something, and also an author's or publisher's statement at the beginning of a book of indebtedness. Okay? Acknowledgement, the opposite of acknowledgement is denial. So now I want to show you the, also a minister, Black South Africans' response following this.
He started for now. but he's speaking about his experience, and I respect his experience. But there's a deep level, as he's saying, of ignorance. He admits it. He was not aware. And I don't know my father, how old he is. But it just tells you, if Mama would hear this, that is, what do you mean you didn't know? This is what Father said.
And be risky by doing anything, messing with the controls. Just as a reference, you'll hear him say a couple of times, father or my brother. It's a honorific in South Africa to address an elder man who's older than you are as father and greet them as you're passing on the street, father. So people greeting me on the street, someone would call me mama. Like, oh, that's so sweet. So it doesn't literally mean, so at one point he says, my brother, referring to the white African man who just spoke, and then said, my father, because he wants to show that respect.
History, their documentations, you know. So I think it's
nonverbals are great.
And I understand he speaks from a sincere point of view. He will speak about farmers, and if you ask the farmers, they are white farmers. But if you speak about crime in South Africa, the most people that are affected by crime are blacks. Those who do not have resources to go to newspapers. You see, so that dynamic of his world, because his world is majority white. And it's perpetuated in that way so that he's more close to his own than close to the other. You know, so I really respect him sharing it, but if it was in a bigger group, people will be very angry. That's why I said it's ignorance. Because all his life has been with whites. And being in this space, it's still safe because the majority is still here, is white. And
you see how difficult it is for a South African white male to just open your mouth.
Let me finish.
And say things.
Let me finish. Now, I put it to you to say, I'm wondering, what about white people? I'm creating a space. I didn't know he was going to respond. Because I'm sincere to find out what trauma did they experience, that we do not forget that there's two parties involved. But he defends himself. Did you understand? He does not speak about the trauma, but he speaks about the good life that he experienced. It's fair, that is his experience. I don't take it away from him. Look, he's quite correct. I come from a majority white school. All my friends at school, at high school, they're not in the country. He's quite correct. All of them are in Australia and the UK, Canada and America. If there was a funeral of one of our friends, and I send them invitation, guys, so and so died, they said, no, we're not in the country. All of them. In my high school, there was about 200 matriculants. There was 5 blacks. All, and not even one is still in the country. So there is that fear of the future within the white South Africans. But when we have conversations of this nature, I think we should be, as Mfundi said, empathetic, put ourselves in the shoes before you say, this is the reasons. And the way we are speaking, we're saying, we are not elusive of the system that was there. And we're not blaming anyone more than we are blaming the system and how it allowed people to participate, willingly or unwillingly. But I'm saying there's a deep black pain that white South Africans continue to ignore. And if they can just take a leap of faith to put themselves where black people were, despite being directly involved or not directly involved, the system benefited you tremendously at the expense of the majority. So I'm not denying my brother's or my father's story, but the way he alludes speaks to the conversations that white people have by themselves. When they talk about South Africa, it goes to what I said. When I was in the classroom, the white teacher told me, this country is going to the dogs. That thing almost changed the way I viewed black people. I almost hated my people. So, yeah. So if someone else, but this is the dynamics that we deal with.
That's how deep is.
Okay, so I think that's a great example of that third dialectic. So before we stop today, just want to play a little bit and speculate with you around these dialectics of what can we learn from this. So we talked about 3 of these tensions, that both of these things are going on simultaneously. We want justice, we want forgiveness. What do we do with these? So we have a diagram that solves everything. So if we're on a dialectic, we're kind of sliding back and forth on one dimension. And when we talk about dialectics in all sorts of other contexts and other disciplines, we talk about transcending. How do you find a third point it goes beyond this mutual exclusivity and this tension? And I think for the violence and the let's just carry on and do things like we've always done at dialectic, a good transcendent thing to think about is humility and mutuality, and maybe something that we can also apply to racism in the United States. How do we learn from each other with absolute humility? I'm not the expert. I don't know everything. You also know things. You also have had experiences, and I want to learn and understand those. And then mutuality reflects, how do I see our needs aligning, that we have mutual needs? How do we work together so that we mutually meet the needs of everyone involved? One example of this in South Africa is a travel company that I have worked with a number of times, who owns a travel company. So one of the things is poverty tourism. You may have heard that kind of buzzword of the ethics that sometimes tour buses will go into the townships, drive through, you look through a bus window at how people are living in poverty. And that's a kind of voyeuristic activity that does not promote understanding. So he wanted to fight against that. But he also wanted to help the community. So he works with the Kliptown Development Project in the Soweto Township. He brings tourists in, but he educates tourists. And he takes the money that he makes from the tourists and throws it right back into the community for schools, computers, books within this community development project. That's more mutuality. I mean, somewhat of an example of meeting mutual needs. How do we transcend that justice versus forgiveness? I want punishment. These people got to pay. No. We've got to go with Desmond Tutu. Our only chance of healing is to forgive and to move on. And I think an answer to that is restorative justice. So restorative justice is, and you can read volumes on this, but it's a process by which, rather than looking at a sentence as punitive, how do you restore the community that you have damaged? Okay. So rather than putting you in prison, how do I bring you out of prison to fix the graffiti, the wall that you graffitied on somebody's private property? How do you restore the community? Okay. So an example of this in South Africa is something called Black Christmas in 1996. So again, we're at a time when things are peace accords and things are being negotiated, and we're in the process of this, and yet we still have this horrible violence. A group of white supremacists bombed a shopping mall on Christmas Eve, where they knew that the people there would be Black and or colored people. And a small community, number of people killed, a great number of people injured in this bombing, just devastated this community. One of the perpetrators, Peter Cortese, is working with restorative justice and saying, how can I go back to this community and restore what I broke? So when he got out of prison, he went back to the community. You think he was welcomed into that community? Oh, no, right? He started planting flowers. He started volunteering in the school. He started doing things and said, I am here to give my life to restoring what I broke, because I realized that I did something wrong. That's restorative justice. That gets beyond just punitive justice, but also gives us something to hang on to, that there is some sort of action beyond forgiveness. How do we get beyond acknowledgement and denial, ignorance, which I think is so beautifully portrayed in that clip that I showed you, right? Tom Aaron Horse is on a church committee with me where we're working with Tisby's model. I'm like, hey, this one works, Tom. But I think that's a way of, Tisby is a writer who writes from a theological perspective for the church in America today of how do we address racism and what is our responsibility here. And he has a model of awareness, relationships, and commitment. And I think that, again, is a transcendent point, a model that we can work with to transcend this tension between acknowledgement and denial. What's an example of that? I think an excellent example of that, if you're familiar with it, is the Belhar Confession. Belhar Confession comes out of South Africa. It is truly remarkable. The Reformed Church of America adopted as their fourth confession in all of their history over hundreds of years. The Belhar Confession is one of those four that was recently adopted. So it's a confession of faith to say we confess the sins of racism. We confess our complicity in systems that have benefited us at the expense of others. And that if we're to be united as Christians, this is a way to do it through awareness of the past, relationship building, and a commitment to change. And part of what's left out of Tisby's model a little bit, but I would like to emphasize, is change. We can't keep doing the same thing. We've got to change. Okay? So those are just some examples of statements that kind of play into these transcendent points. How can we learn from others? How can we repair and restore what is broken? How can we educate ourselves? How can we act in solidarity? Just some ideas, kind of prompts to think about transcending the racism that we also find ourselves in the United States. I made it. So it was touch and go there for a while. So let's talk. Let's just have a conversation. You don't have to just ask questions of me, but talk to each other too, about things that you've heard or things that you find interesting.
We'll have to use the mic so that remote people can hear.
I turn this up.
Any questions?
I felt that video was very interesting. I was, when the white guy, I don't know what to call him, but felt like, you know, while he was talking. But I was wondering where the conversation went after that, after the black guy talked. Yeah.
It was very, very tense, but it was a tremendous learning experience in that tension, in being uncomfortable. Everyone in that space, in that room, was uncomfortable. So we were nearing the end of the session, and the community wants to continue having these conversations and being able to talk about it, inviting people into their space to talk about race and healing and about stories. So, and I talked to the Afrikaan man afterwards and thanked him for saying what he said, because it came from his heart. It was absolutely authentic. And I'm sure he felt like, you know, the whole group is now against me. But it came from his heart. It was authentic. It needed to be said. And it's in the minds of many, many people that maybe aren't articulating it. But it was a great opportunity to learn from that. And he seemed fine afterwards.
In thinking about restoring community, and really South Africa, like the United States, has never has had an intact community. Would think about the racial community, and so in South Africa's experience, if you look at political reforms, justice and police reforms and educational reforms and economic reforms. In my mind, I think without economic reform, you can't achieve any of the others. But, and I know that's just my perspective, but and it applies here in our country too. But I was just wondering, when you hear that kind of comment, how would you respond to that?
I agree with you. I think without economic reforms, you're not going to have change. People are living on subsistence living. And until you get beyond that, you can't fix the rest of the other problems. You don't have the time, the capacity, the resources. So it is a tremendous problem. There are areas where there was progress, certainly if you read the TRC, and there's like volumes of books, it takes up like the whole back of the car with these, but there were plans in place. I mean, they recognized this, that there's got to be a redistribution of wealth within the country. And so they had goals set for 2023, ironically, 30 years, that we were going to have 30% of farms were going to be owned by Black ownership, 30% of the mines would be owned with Black ownership. And the statistics on the extent to which they've made progress toward those goals. I mean, some of the mine ownership is now 22, 23%. There's stuff in the news yet this week about they're fighting in the courts over that mine ownership issues. So yes, and I think you got to have a plan and you've got to keep working toward those goals. I think they're meeting those goals were delayed by corrupt leaders and then billions of dollars that got siphoned off to other places. But you see education, you see more integrated universities, you see progress, but the progress is slow. And I guess, I mean, in a realistic sense, how do you take a system that was that extreme and 25 years later, should we expect it to be any better than it is now? I mean, in some sense, it's going to take a while to break down those systems and ways of doing things.
South Africa is such a large country and it's so different in all the different areas. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, is there, usually what we see is in Joburg or Cape Town, but areas like Durban and Pretoria, and then even the rural areas, the Drakensberg Mountains, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And is this, you tend to think that it's just in Joburg or in certain areas, but are attempts at trying to do the healing taking place all over or just in particular areas?
I think that's happening mostly in the big cities and the big population areas. Yeah. And those are also where you get a little bit more progressive political perspective. And the rural areas are suffering tremendously. So lack of employment and economic disparity and many of those places, just a real sense of hopelessness. And again, you've got a large country. So to reach education and healthcare to these more remote areas is very, very difficult. And the change, I would say, is not happening there.
We have a couple of questions online. First of all, how did you select the people for the interviewing?
Largely by a convenience sample, meaning the people that we could make through contacts. And then we sought to stratify that sample to ensure that we had an equal distribution across race, across age groups. So we worked through, I had been in South Africa in 2015 and 2016, so contacts I had there, worked through Stellenbosch University Department of Theology and contacts that they had within the community. Worked with churches that we had made contact with, and then again trying to get a balance of Black church community, a colored church community, and an Afrikaan church community. And did homestays in each of those areas as well. Mm-hmm. So yes, that was the hodgepodge of a convenience sample is what we call it when it's not completely randomized. It's not. It was by contacts that we could reach. We also had to have people who spoke English, and not everyone speaks English. And just to remember, as you hear those transcripts, people are speaking in a second or third or fifth or 11th language there. So we had to find people that spoke English to be part of that interview sample.
And one other comment, it's discouraging in the US today to see the push to keep students unaware of our racial history and how it affects today. The idea that young people and adults should never be uncomfortable makes me sad and angry.
Discomfort is the genesis of learning. I think if you're not to be made uncomfortable, then you're probably not stretching yourself to learn.
How long did the experiment take in terms of the beginnings and the endings? Is it still continuing? Also, I wanted to ask about the two ministers. Were they able to speak from the same common understanding of Christianity, or how would that affect their relationships?
Oh, wow. That's a really fun question. First, the students participated in the summer of 2018. That's when we collected the interviews. We then spent a solid 2 years transcribing them with some of those students, and then bringing more students onto the research team to help with the transcription and coding. Now we're at a point where we've got the data and to start doing more analysis and writing. About 4 weeks that they were in the country, and then they had spent 16 weeks prior to that studying, so they weren't going in completely ignorant of the history and the culture. The two ministers. So religion in South Africa is absolutely fascinating. And the Christian religion in South Africa, I should say, is absolutely fascinating. So you've got the Dutch Reformed Church, the Afrikaans Church. You've got the United Mission Reformed Church, which was essentially the Dutch Afrikaans evangelizing to the Black community, which were Black, but in the Reformed tradition, but they had to worship separately under apartheid. And now you have the Uniting Reformed Church, which is this congregation in Mossel Bay. And the idea of the Uniting Reformed Church is we should not be divided across all these different ways in terms of the Reformed Church in South Africa. We should be united across racial divides. So the Belhar Confession came out of, and the Uniting Reformed Church developed out of that idea that we should be unified. Problem being is that the Dutch Reformed Church still has not ratified the Belhar Confession. It's interesting. Churches in Holland, Michigan have adopted the Belhar Confession. The CRC, the RCA in the United States, the Presbyterian USA Church in the United States has ratified and accepted the Belhar Confession, but the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa is still out. So it's an interesting tradition. So I don't know specifically, but I would guess they're all coming from the Reformed Church tradition. So they would share some language understanding. Yeah.
Dee, I have two process questions. One is, when you went into the interview process, were they standard questions that each person was asked? And then the second part of my question is, as follow-up for these young students, I'm not at all concerned that they were uncomfortable and they were hearing traumatic stories, but I'm wondering what kind of follow-up came when they were back here as far as how to continue to process those stories for the deeper learning instead of just burying what they heard.
Right. So the processing at the time, students did feel uncomfortable and were quick to identify psychological distress from listening to these interviews and doing several interviews a day and listening to these stories. And so we spent quite a lot of time with the group trying to process that as they were going through it and recognizing if you're experiencing a secondary trauma, keep that in mind, because the person you're talking to, this happened to them directly, but not to negate that it does take a psychological toll to listen to these very traumatic stories and to be really present and with somebody and supportive when they're telling those stories. Unfortunately, when we came back and the group in Pakistan went back to Pakistan and Slovakia went back to Slovakia and Hope students and everybody dispersed in various directions, there has been no follow-up. as a whole group. So there have been individual relationships that have been developed and people that keep in contact, but not a formalized process for debriefing and reflecting on what they learned. So the students that were still continuing, that weren't seniors and weren't graduating immediately, did some work the following year and 2 years in, still working on the project as a research team, and part of that learning and debriefing and pulling together, synthesizing what they've learned occurred there, but that was for a small fragment of those students. So yeah, that problem with our educational system, that we disperse and don't have that opportunity. Was there another question at the beginning? Standardized questions. They had, we did a lot of training for doing the interviews. They had 6 broad questions, and then again, 3 people participating in the interview. So one person asks a question, one person there is solely to take field notes and to address a follow-up question in case the interviewer misses it, and the other person is the tech person. And then they rotated those roles. But 6 broad questions, but we also had a more open-ended process. So if somebody goes off and is telling you something really important and a good story, we're not going to shut that off in order to try to get through. We have to get through all 6 questions. So we started with things like, so tell me, when you were coming of age in South Africa, you're 18, 20, 22 or whatever, what was happening in South Africa and how did that affect you? What was your experience with that? So that was our intro question.
Yeah, I lived in the country of Swaziland from 1986 to 1990. And so that was in the apartheid period. And I had made several trips into South Africa during that time. And I have to say, I experienced apartheid several times where I was uncomfortable, you know, where I was given privileged spots to stand. I had to be on a different train because of that. I was allowed to be on a beach where blacks weren't. And I felt uncomfortable with that at the time. I will also say that this whole situation is pretty complicated. The whole business of land reform is difficult because if you owned a farm, it's been in your family for 3 or 4 or 5 generations. Yeah. And now the government says, you can no longer live there. We're taking this. We're giving this to somebody else. I mean, that is a very difficult situation. And, you know, if you want to look at the productivity of that farm, that's another situation because that farm may be producing a great amount of food for the people of the country. Well, in Swaziland, they had a Chinese mission where the Chinese were coming to teach the Swazis how to farm. And so they would learn from that and then be expected to go back and apply the principles to their farm and be very productive. The problem was that never happened because the people would come to that farm, learn the principles, and they would go back and they would not use the principles that they had learned. They would go back to the way they had always done things. And this is a problem that we saw in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, they took the land away from the white people, gave it to the black, and the productivity plummeted so severely that country used to be an exporter of food to the other countries in Africa, and now they are starving. They are having to import food, and we're seeing the same things on the land in South Africa. Is that they give the land to black people. In general, I mean, there may be specific exceptions to this, but what happens is the productivity goes down to almost zero because they're not. I think it's a cultural thing. I don't think it's a racial thing. I think it's a cultural thing where they've learned to do subsistence farming rather than to do farming for profit It's a different way of farming.
As you say, it's a very complicated process and complicated situation. And it's, I would say they're not, taking the farm away from somebody and just giving it to somebody else. It's when land comes up for sale, then is there an opportunity for Black ownership of that land, where it might all in the past have gone to a side agreement between two Afrikaners. I'm going to sell you part of my land and 1,000 acres over here. So that there's an opportunity for Black ownership, but also you've got to look at tough farming conditions in many parts of South Africa. And so I get the land. Yay, I've got my land. Where's my combine? Where's my plow? Where's all the mechanized equipment that I need to run this farm like it's been run the past 10 years? I may not have also gotten that to go with it. Where's the water for my cattle? And that was just one example of this stark, the system is so complicated in the way that it can divert resources in one direction and leave people starving on the other side of the fence. So I would hesitate to make generalizations that the Black farmers don't want to use productive methods to produce and have successful farms. I think they do, and they want to be economically successful. But I think it's going to take some time and some resources to help that to happen. And yes, when you're going through a dramatic transition like that, and you've got people leaving the country and leaving their farms, and you've got big corporations coming in from Belgium and buying up farmland and running the farm and employing workers instead of it being owned within the country, and then taking that profit rather than reinvesting in the farm and taking it back to Belgium. Those are some of the complicating factors of why we've not seen this, immediate success. So I think those are issues that need to be addressed and unpacked.
Okay. It looks like
we just have one quick question of clarification. So were some of the students from Pakistan or Lebanon? You kind of referred to both.
In 2016, it was Slovakia, Hope College, and Lebanon. And so I'm sorry if that got confusing someplace when I was talking. And in 2018, when we did the research project and the interviews, it was Pakistan, Slovakia, and Hope College. So
thank you so much, Dr. Johnston. This was a very illuminating course.
Thank you. Yeah.